Seminar. Today we have Corinne Unger talking about landmine rehabilitation. So Corinne has completed a Bachelor of Science in Geomorphology in the University of Macquarie University in New South Wales. I just learned what is geomorphology. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but that was a new word for me. It's how the landscape forms. Corinne has worked in soil conservation, in the mining industry, in mine rehabilitation, in Northern Territory, 10 years with the Queensland government on regulation and abandoned mine rehabilitation. And now basically she's working at the CMLR, so within the SMI. She's going next week to Peru with Dr. Mansour Edraki on the IM4DC project on abandoned mine in the catchment of Lake Titicaca. And so please help me welcome Corinne.
Good morning. I often speak to my dog about abandoned mines and legacies because for quite a while, and probably still to some degree, often not an audience, so thank you for coming. It's a difficult topic and it's a hard one to, I think, for the industry and governments and those that are influenced by them to actually know how to tackle them. It's one of those wicked problems, I think. But, and increasingly it's sort of the ball and chain. So that was the perception I had of working in abandoned mines. It was really holding the industry back. The perception of mining based on the history of very old mines often. But now I see it more like a boa constrictor around the dog. It's kind of closing in, unless we really address these issues, it really is going to have an increasing impact on the industry, particularly social licence aspects. So, we're talking both about risks and opportunities, and probably a strong focus on abandoned mines more than other sorts of mining legacies, but it interacts. So just a little bit about why mines close. Are you able to film me if I walk around? Does that matter? I'm just a bit free-ranging here. So David Lawrence has done a huge body of work on mine closure, 200 mines over about 2 decades, and on Australia. So it's very insightful about when there were peaks and troughs and when the major closures occurred. And so why do they close? Well, 25% close from this research he did due to resource depletion. So all the other reasons flow out from that point. Obviously high costs, low prices is nearly equally significant. But there's a whole range of reasons why mines close. But the really significant thing is that it doesn't all happen in a logical way. I think we're all aware of that mines can close suddenly for various reasons, which means that unplanned closure, or being ready for unplanned closure, is a critical part of planning at mines. It's like we've got this long-term plan, but we also have to have that one in case we shut early, and that often doesn't happen. And the main environmental impact from his research was acid mine drainage, or acid metalliferous drainage, then tailings and voids, and so on. So the critical thing in this time period was that most of the mines were gold mines, and most were in Western Australia, and then Northern Territory, Queensland, New South Wales. But the significant thing is that acid mine drainage from an environmental impact perspective. Socio-economic impacts, well, directly employees, then the regional local business, and the indirect employee, sterilised ore, and those other impacts. So this is just a bit of a big picture view of what are the impacts of closure. Health and safety, well, vertical openings, the biggest risk. Void, substance, landscapes, and so on. So just some pictures. So normally when you plan for closure, you want to have a safe, stable, non-polluting mine site with sustainable land uses. And that's a fairly broad statement at the end, but it can be anything, just so long as there's something sustaining that piece of land. It's about not writing off that parcel of land. And this is sometimes challenging, depending on the age of the mine in particular. In this case, it's a heritage-listed shaft because it's dug by the Chinese and it's in the Northern Territory and it happens to be fenced out. So it's very different to all the other shafts that exist, which have virtually no value. So So looking at the opposite of safe, stable, non-polluting and sustainable, we have the unsafe, the unstable, heap leach piles. We have polluting sites, in this case acid mud drainage in the Dig River, Mount Oxide, Rukanga. Mansell gets very excited about these photos, I must say, because he's a geochemist. I don't like them as much. And unsustainable when you have, say, under drainage designed into tailings facilities to maximise consolidation and capacity of a tailings storage facility, and then it stops suddenly, and you have no mechanism to really maintain the function of that impoundment. So, in this case, a very large impoundment with very shallow, tailings mass, which, in hindsight probably would have been better in some sort of cellular design, but it was a massive area with very little tailings in there, but just enough to be annoying. And have seepage just continue out underneath that tailings impoundment, creating a huge impact on the neighbouring environment. So this is in the catchment of the Edith River in the Northern Territory, Mount Todd. So you can have unsustainable landforms, but you can also have unsustainable vegetation. So you can have weeds like gamba grass, which grows very vigorously vertically, but doesn't provide much erosion protection. And then you have these massively hot fires which kill everything there. And so you end up with this situation where there's a cover over uranium mill tailings and waste rock. This is run jungle. And that vegetative cover, which was designed into it, is no longer functioning, so the whole system fails. And you can have unsustainable land uses. You can have a heritage listed site, and there's no heritage conservation, no one's visiting the site, no one's learning from the site. Just small challenges. Mount Morgan, really high unemployment, 23% about 10 years after that mine closed. And one of the challenges with Mount Morgan is it actually closed in line with the laws of the time, so it's often referred to as an abandoned mine, but it's not truly abandoned. That mining company left in line with the laws of the time, and it was in anticipation of changing regulations that they packed up and left, because they knew that those standards wouldn't be able to be met. And that's another significant trigger for closure, is seeing regulatory changes happening. So it's in the early 90s. There are cumulative impacts from small mines, so sometimes small mines can be downplayed a little bit, but if you have lots of them, it can be just as destructive. And I don't think we're very good at quantifying cumulative impacts from small mines in Australia. And of course, the artisanal mining, globally has wide-ranging impacts from health, safety, socio-economic, and so on. But that's another kind of legacy. But sometimes not a legacy; it's happening concurrently with mining. So in Australia, what we've actually got is an increased awareness of the liabilities around legacies through various reports. The identification of legislative black holes, that abandoned mines or mines when they're closed, they just sort of go into this abyss. So the abandoned mines themselves are in this black hole, if that's possible to imagine. So all the normal legislation which addresses it while it's operating, there isn't anything to deal with it when it comes through the other side. So that's a context of where we're at the moment. And the really critical thing is the withdrawal of social licence, which is a potential flow-on impact from having a whole heap of legacy issues that aren't being addressed. Now, most of the abandoned mines are actually in the responsibility of governments, so I'll talk about that a bit further. So it's really about the role of industry and governments in addressing this. So there's a little bit of looking back and forward here. Talked a little bit about the risks. I'm going to talk about Australian abandoned mine strategic framework. What is a leading practice of abandoned mine management? The maturity model that I've been working on, based on safety maturity models, and the opportunities for implementation of that in Australia, and a bit about the journey that we're on, I hope. So abandoned mines are mines where mining leases or titles no longer exist, and the responsibility cannot be allocated to an individual company or organisation. And so much of what I'm talking about is abandoned mines, and there are different sorts of legacy sites, but this is what I want to talk about today. So that's from our Australian strategic framework. So back in 2011, when I started my one day a week at CMLR, the first thing Alex Lechner and I did was a bit of a map. So we tried to look at what was in the public domain. Where are the abandoned mines? How many are there? So more than 50,000. We wanted to understand a little bit about data quality, just in a very high level way, because this work isn't funded. And so the red just indicates no data, and blue indicates some data around that particular issue, whether it's a location, whether there's spatial data for the location, the mine type is explained, and so on. So you just see it's highly variable, and actually every jurisdiction defines them differently, so you really can't draw too many comparisons across here. And in fact, the first number for Western Australia was massively high because they had a very good inventory and had those features mapped by individual features rather than clustered around a mine. So very difficult to interpret this map, but it's just an idea of what each of the jurisdictions has registered as an abandoned mine. There were only 3 states that had a program, a formal abandoned mine program at that time. It was Queensland, New South Wales and Tasmania. And just in the last year, Western Australia and Northern Territory have introduced levies on legacy issues. In Northern Territory, they call it a levy. Western Australia is a pooled funding model, which is 1% of the rehabilitation liability for the mines is collected as a cash fund by the government. They're different schemes. I won't talk a lot about them today. But anyway, that's happened, and South Australia and Victoria still don't have programs, but they do have the occasional site they're looking after, like Mount Lyell and Tassie and Brakunda in South Australia. So back to 2003, there was a forum in Brisbane around abandoned mines led by Clive Bell, and they brought everyone together. At that stage I was managing Mount Morgan, and this was a fairly significant forum as far as I was concerned, because it brought together all the states, and it was very clear that everyone was in a different place in terms of what was happening. But together, if we got together, we would be able to learn from each other. A lot of the momentum was lost, but still, that's part of the context. So out of that, there was a recommendation that we have a national strategy in Australia that tries to bring the states together, and the strategic framework was developed. Very slow process, took forever, and then when it was written, they disbanded the committee. So this is currently dormant. But it was written around 5 chapters: valuing abandoned mines, data collection and management, risk assessment, resource and partnerships, and information sharing. Some fairly sound principles, very light on policy and legislation, but we'll come back to that. There's no action plan. So this is really what's motivated me to some degree, that we can just do so little about something that we know exists and is a challenge. So in 2008, in the midst of this writing process, I know I wasn't employed by the government at the time, so I wasn't involved, and this was just a government-led initiative. I was invited to this forum and looked around this forum, and there was nobody from any Australian government there, not at a Commonwealth government level or at a state level. And this was really significant. It was organised by the International Council for Mines and Metals and IUCN, the Conservation Union for the Conservation of Nature. It was something that had come out of MMSD, Mines, Minerals and Sustainable Development Initiative from 2002. So it was following a path based on some fairly solid research around 2002. And so that forum was a very important time for me, and out of that I made some connections and applied for a Churchill Fellowship to go and actually study in detail some of the projects that I learnt about at that forum. So I thought, if I don't understand this, I can't help us in Australia to apply that in the absence of any Australian government interest. So this was the program plan to look at global programs. So through the International Atomic Energy Agency, there's a global uranium abandoned mine program, down to local programs. And the Canadian analogy is perhaps the closest to ours, where they have a national orphan and abandoned mine initiative, and every province has their own program. So I wanted to understand what was going on like at the state level, what was happening at the national level to help support these programs. So starting in Vienna, at the International Atomic Energy Agency, spent a few days there understanding how those programs worked. Then across to the former East Germany to look at Wismut's uranium mine rehabilitation program, which was massive, and a whole range of features from underground mining to open cut, lots of tailings dams being rehabilitated. and to a very high standard and all coordinated extremely well. So more densely populated areas, but different standards, because still I was interested in not only the motivation, and the impetus, but also who was engaged in these processes, how did they all interact. Rehabilitation of waste dumps, returning tailings dams to useful land uses, developing visitor centre to interpret what they've done, tell the story of the history from pre-reunification in Germany right through to the present, from prisoners of war mining there to the abandonment at reunification through to the restoration of the landscape. Some really significant phases. Then up to the former brown coal mining region of Lusatia, not far from the Polish border, where there's a whole heap of former brown coal mines. Another mining region which was abandoned when reunification occurred in Germany. And led by a team of landscape architects as well as engineers, there was this double focus on creating new landscapes and new economies, while stabilising these pits as they filled them with water and turned it into a network of lakes for recreation, tourism and new businesses around this modified landscape. So this just shows water treatment as part of the infilling of pits, and they redirected rivers to speed up the filling of pits so that they could manage the stability and water quality as that happened, rather than just waiting for it to slowly happen. And conceptualising these landscapes, this is more of an artist's impression, but these buildings are where there was a conference held, and it was the 10 years on review conference, and I was able to fit that into my program, which was fantastic to learn about this whole EBA-C project. So it's an internationally significant project. And in the process of closure there, they were retaining heritage values, in this case a conveyor bridge that would otherwise have been cut up for scrap. So it was an example of how having that landscape architecture, post-mining land use focus tied in with the engineering and stability aspects, like addressing both aspects, meant that they were able to capitalise on this and then transform this into a tourist attraction which has a light show. And if I was clever, I'd have the light show happening up here. But, and you could go on this tour, and this is just massive. We just walked on that for hours, just going from one end to the other and back. But just fascinating, and this is apparently one part of Germany, or perhaps even globally, where this type of extractive method was undertaken. It's not that common just because of the flat landscape and the nature of the coal deposit. So conveyor bridges aren't everywhere, apparently. And then they wrote an opera about it and developed a dance, and then helped interpret this story through the conference, after the dinner. And I just thought how entirely they embraced this rejuvenation of landscapes in this region, and it was just a bit mind-blowing, to be honest. Anyway, across to Cornwall, England, where some of you may have heard of the Eden Project, where they turned an old China clay pit into a sustainability theme park. So the focus was on education and making sure that visitors could come here and learn about our connection to the land and why we rely on the land and environment for, there's biodiversity, there's food and our textiles. And so this, not only a rehabilitation project, but an education place, but they call it their WOW site, and it really is, and they have biomes with tropical ecosystems and Mediterranean ecosystems, so, and an ice rink in there in winter, and various activities happening all through the year. And it's self-funding now, it's charity. It did start with some lottery funding. I wish we had more lottery funding here. I'll be doing things with it here as an opportunity. Yeah. Can't say dipping our toes in Mount Morgan, but certainly here on this side there's lots of opportunities. Anyway, so the thing about the WOW site though is it attracted a whole lot of other innovation around Cornwall, and that's the beauty of that post-mining alliance that formed. They started to communicate leading practices and engaging with communities and showing new ways of engaging to develop these new land uses, and also helping communities let go, because communities don't want to let go of mining. So even at Mount Morgan, most of the community would say, oh, we're waiting for that next company to come and start up and we'll have jobs and everything again. So somebody at some point has to actually say, right, we're going to move on. This is unlikely to happen, or whatever. So this was Now, building in heritage into new businesses in a really socio-economically depressed part of Cornwall. It's like going to be like a business park, and within this building they've been interpreting the story of the guy that invented the fuse. Can't think of his name, but he just came from down the road. And so in this interpretive centre they're going to have this big fuse, this light going right around the building. It's pretty amazing as well. And this was led by Cornwall Council. So then down the road to Geargore Tin Mine, and while it's a pretty spectacular site with a mine and infrastructure just on the coastline there, and I was lucky to have a sunny day, it was really a story of collaboration. It was really how the local heritage group and the Cornwall Council and the National Trust with volunteers and paid staff, how they all worked together to try and make this area attractive, because they really felt like they're in the middle of nowhere. I don't know what the middle of nowhere is, because that's what we have in Australia. But over there, it's down the pointy end of Cornwall, and it's hard to get visitors, so they want to make sure they got people down there and that they would go to each of those attractions to try and make them viable. So they have a visitor centre, they have restaurants, and they have cash flow coming into these sites. So they were able to conserve these old features, and most of the mill was built out of timber. It was pretty amazing. So not far from the Eden project, there was an Eco Towns project. So this was an industry-led project by Imerys Industrial Minerals Company for some of their former sites. They hadn't abandoned them, but they were just sitting there doing nothing. So they tried to integrate about 6 of these into a low carbon economy Eco Town project. They applied through an Eco Towns. It was like a competition. They had to tender for it, and they joined forces with some Middle Eastern investors, and so they've got this project started. It's major, but it is integrating these old mine pits into new uses. So really, at the Eden project, they talk a lot about unconventional partnerships, looking for unusual connections, because some of the normal pathways just aren't going to work when it comes to rejuvenating the sites. Creative financial mechanisms, new legal instruments, innovative consultation, and so on. But really it's about new economies. Then across to Canada, and the National Orphan and Abandoned Mine Initiative, which is really run by 2 people. The 2 people on the left, and on the right is the Mining Association of Canada representative. So they have a lot of support from the Mining Association of Canada, so it's equivalent of our MCA, and I'm kind of looking for the same level of leadership here, but we haven't got it yet. I'm working on it. So that initiative brings together the provincial abandoned mine, contaminated land managers, and through this multi-stakeholder advisory group and others, to talk about what are the big challenges they've all got in common, and then they undertake research or studies like legislative mechanisms, like there might be legal obstacles to accessing land to actually clean them up. So they actually address them together, and in doing so, making far more progress than we are here. But it's a useful model to learn from. And it's what we're trying to set up, and we still are, at CMLR. And we've had a forum to talk about that. So across to British Columbia, and this is where I learned more about the relationship between the provinces and Naomi, but the Crown Contaminated Sites program was my focus. And there I learned that the Auditor General had audited the program in 2002 and said, it's in disarray, you've got different departments trying to manage these sites, you need to bring it under one agency, you must be fully accounting for liability under accrual accounting requirements, so that was critical, that seemed to be the turning point. Once they fully accounted for these liabilities, then they started to address them properly in a really organised fashion. They had 2 levels of evaluation in terms of, from their desktop reviews, which sites do we need to investigate. They had a risk tool, they developed it. They have an external review process where they bring in experts to look at their own risk assessment to say, do you think we're going to fix up the right sites in terms of what the priorities are, looking at environment, health, safety, all of those aspects. And then they produce these performance reports every 2 years, and they report on how much money they've spent and how they've reduced their liabilities. So from an accountability perspective, they provide a very useful benchmark. So what is leading practice? So in my attempt to summarise it all, it's really around just using the baseball pitch analogy. Safety is first base. The site has to be safe, otherwise you can't even study the site. You don't want the public or anyone harming themselves. Environment and health tend to go together because they require often a little bit more investigation, some long-term data, sometimes some detailed analysis of soils, water, and so on. But you also have to understand the values of the site, and so what can we get out of this site, what can we use it for, what value is going to come from this, so that we're not just spending money and it just goes nowhere, and then we just lock up a site and say, well, that's that, you can't go in, fence it out, put a padlock on, or whatever. So that is definitely an approach in some jurisdictions. And those values can vary. You can have assets on a site, you can have heritage values. Some of those heritage values are seen as liabilities as well. That you can have secondary mining. And this opportunity is, I think, poorly understood in that it may be overestimated in terms of that value, but it also hasn't been studied so that we can actually have really accurate understanding of the values, and obviously that changes as commodity prices change. But some sort of whole jurisdiction review would help to say some of these sites actually do have some potential for future secondary mining or new mining, because land access is hard enough within the industry. So let's use these sites where we can. But there needs to be some systematic way, rather than government saying, "Oh, this might be mined again in the future. We're not going to touch it," so that none of the issues are addressed. And alternative land uses. Let's really look at what we can use these sites for. So when you do the whole, home run, you have environmental benefits as well as socio-economic benefits. But really the stakeholder engagement process has to go through at every stage, and that's, at a local level, but you can also, I believe, apply this at a jurisdiction level. So within governments, it's about, government departments as well, who manage these different aspects talking to each other, and we don't actually have that level of sophistication happening yet in Australia, perhaps starting to in Western Australia and Northern Territory, but Northern Territory's got a smaller bureaucracy, and I think that's easier. But the way that may start does require some leadership from governments as well as industry. And community capacity building, employment training, those opportunities that could come from that. In USA, there's participatory monitoring programs that involve the community. It helps to manage conflict as well as to provide a high level of transparency. Training programs, most of our mines are in regional remote areas, so there's a whole lot of employment work around heritage conservation buildings. There's training as earthworks, there's mining. There's opportunities there that just are unrealised because there's absolutely no energy around that, and perhaps not even any vision, and it just sounds hard and needs money. But some of those things, once they start, can satisfy 4 different purposes through one task, and that's what I'm kind of focusing on, is those synergies. So, having looked at it overseas at a different scale, what's going on at a local level right through to international, and what are all the stakeholders doing, government, industry, NGOs, researchers, or civil society? I find in Australia that we rely very heavily on state government to solve all these issues, and if it's not happening, then everyone just sort of gets grumpy and frustrated and goes away. But what's happened overseas is you've got all these other linkages. You have researchers involved, there's funding for different things, but those relationships have been built. And it's not that state government doesn't have a role, they clearly do, from a legislative point of view. They are the regulators of the industry, so they are responsible for the legacies, they are responsible for abandoned mine programs and so on. But they also should be taking those learnings and integrating them back into environmental requirements for new mines. And there is actually a disconnect in Queensland, for example. The Mine Safety Department manages abandoned mines, and the Environment Department is managing environment heritage. And the two from Queensland Audit Office, what issues is really highlighted over the last several decades. There's actually not been a great conversation there happening about any of these issues, and so the learning isn't happening. So it's not about more regulation, but it's really about more focused. What are the critical things you need? So where are the opportunities? Because that's all been a bit depressing sometimes. Well, I think it's around just improving maturity. So understanding what a mature program is, and taking Australian jurisdictions, and they're all at a different stage, through a bit of a pathway, this journey to maturity. So where they're vulnerable, just take them up to the next step. Where they're compliant, well, take that risk and try and be a bit more proactive and so on. So it's about designing for closure rather than planning for closure. So this has flow-on impacts to active mines, where you're really strategically designing. That's where designer tailings comes in, which is a really important research project within SMI, cross-disciplinary, holistic, long-term, thinking sustainably. But if we can design tailings, so they're quite benign. A whole heap of risks just evaporate. And if you want to be able to walk away from a mine site, these things are going to have to happen, because at the moment we've got mining companies managing water in perpetuity because of that absence of planning early on. So those costs, we're just not even measuring them. There's a whole PhD in that. So trying to tie together the national policy with the journey model and the focus of a really mature border collie, because as distinct from a puppy, so a really mature focus. We're trying to develop a maturity model for abandoned mine management and present at some of this at Life of Mine. So just a little bit of that. So just reminding you, there's the 5 chapters of the strategic framework for managing abandoned mines. And I've started with data collection and management, because I actually don't think you can value the abandoned mine until you actually have the data. So a lot of these sites don't have data, and I'll see that as the starting point. But based on that, we've developed 14 elements of evaluative criteria. So this draws on those leading practices from overseas, and starting with the first 3, collecting data, having jurisdiction-wide knowledge of all of those elements, and also site-specific rehab management plans for high-risk sites. That all sits under data. Coming under risk assessment, we have legislation, policy, guidance, and it's about addressing abandoned mines and preventing new ones. Risk assessment, prioritisation, the actual program capacity, who's going to manage this? But within government, we don't have a lot of expertise. I think you can count on 2 hands how many people are managing these sites in Australia. And their skill level, it's not a criticism of them, but governments will employ graduates and just expect them to be able to tackle sites like this, which are highly complex. And so we just need to make those connections with researchers and experienced people and reviewers and so on. Valuing abandoned mines, so it's about beneficial post-mining water and land uses. It might be new ecosystems, it might be different habitat, it might be about bats or rock qualities or something else, but let's look at those values and those opportunities. It's unlikely they'll go back to anything like that. Heritage conservation and indigenous culture. So at Rum Jungle, it's about restoring the indigenous, sort of like a healing process by restoring the landforms. So there's sites there that were mined that were very sensitive sites for the women in that area, and so the rehabilitation is around addressing those needs. Secondary mining, and then resourcing and partnership around the stakeholder engagement, which so far is not as sophisticated in Australia. And then the information sharing, so there's all sorts of different ways that could expand out into 5 different categories. In Finland, we had some visitors recently talked about their mine closure wiki. Absolutely great initiative through the Geological Survey. We could easily set something up like that and suddenly have a whole lot more information available that currently isn't. So just looking at, as an example, having site-specific plan for these high-risk sites. So if you have no site-specific plans for any individual sites, then obviously you're vulnerable. You can have priority sites have data collection programs, and evidence of third-party review of the data would be starting to, in this model, become compliant. But when you start to interpret those reports, make them available to the public, and you can actually see the link between those and the actions on the sites, it's becoming more resilient. And sharing that information across jurisdictional boundaries, so let's just stop working independently in each state and territory of Australia and start building this network. And that was through SMI, through CMLR. We're still hoping to set up this network like the No Army model in Canada, which can not only do some research but also bring them together at regular times to talk about problems that we have in common and helping to solve those problems through research, through sharing tools, setting up some web page. There's a whole lot of stuff that could happen. So just using a web-based review of maturity, so ranking, and this was done by a graduate who didn't have any prior knowledge, just so it wasn't biased by any individual's prior knowledge of abandoned sites. Just looking at what was on the web page and looking at vulnerable through to resilient, so it goes from 1 to 5, and giving it a score for each of the 14 elements of the maturity model. It shows they're very strong on data. They have very good inventory. They did it in the late 1990s after an Aboriginal teenager fell down a shaft and died, and it triggered this massive inventory, but then there was a change of government and loss of knowledge, nothing much happened, and then that government came back in and they started to kick it off again. So clearly these programs are very vulnerable to political changes as well. And a snapshot of other jurisdictions shows pockets of strength in different areas. Queensland actually spends more than any other state on abandoned mines. It's some of this, because it is a web-based search, you can sometimes think, oh, there's a lot happening here, but there may not be, so just that's a caution to note in terms of how good a web page might be as compared to a program, but this is really about the transparency of what is available to the public. Tasmania is pretty good on partnerships. They have to be small jurisdiction, not much money. They have a trust fund committee that gets together, and that involves the Mines Department, the Environment Department, and Heritage, as well as industry, and they help to allocate funding, the small amount of money they have to sites. And they've also, I think, Savage River with the Golden Era Agreement enabled an old historic site to be mined again. And so we really don't have many examples of those agreements that have succeeded. As far as I know, that is still going. South Australia, Northern Territory, but just in comparisons from a benchmarking point of view, the British Columbia Contaminated Sites program is just much higher scores, much more mature in terms of those rankings based on web accessible information. And then over here, where they appear to be weaker, there's actually a brownfields renewals program. It's just on a different web page, and the review didn't pick that up, but that really looks at land that's still close to urban areas and about cleaning up old industrial sites and turning them back into productive land uses. So they would probably rank higher if that was picked up. But that's just how we done that research. So the opportunities, there's new economies, opportunities, biodiversity, linking in with catchment bodies, particularly in central Queensland. The Fitzroy Basin Association being very important to Mount Morgan. Developing WOW sites, very important, but also their role for AutoMem professionals, because they kind of cut across government industry everywhere, so I've also been working through that channel. So in 2012 we had this forum to try and bring everyone together across Australia, so there's not many, working on abandoned mines. And we got the Commonwealth Government there, we got the Minerals Council there, we had the Fitzroy Basin Association, because they're familiar with abandoned mines, we had the Canadians there, the National Orphan Abandoned Mine Initiative, and British Columbia. There were a few more people on that, but there were some 2 days, and so we had kind of a fluctuating group of people. And we worked on this national hub, and there was a lot of silence from the Commonwealth Government, but because they just keep saying it's a state issue, it's not our problem. And so, it was a starting point, but really it's got to be targeted at a higher level. So this was really working with those on the ground to start with, to gather their support. So we developed a value proposition from that, and there was a lot of support but no funding so far. So a lot of notional support. So the potential still exists for that to kick off. So I've looked at some risks. I've told you about the national policy, talked about what leading practice is, and the maturity model that we've been working on. And bear in mind that none of this was funded, so it's all come out of the generosity of David Mulligan and CMLR and colleagues that I can collaborate with there, and I was getting paid one day a week. So it's kind of, we're at the pointy end of trying to lead on this, and it's hard, as it is with all research when you want to lead on something. So I've talked about those opportunities to implement that, so I feel like the model provides a starting point for us to implement the strategic framework. And so I've been in dialogue with different people about putting that back on the COAG agenda so that it flows out through the process that developed it. Needs to go to the next step and say, right, we're going to implement this, because a lot of states are doing nothing, some are doing something, and West Australia is doing quite a lot, and Northern Territory as well, but there's a lot of inactivity there, and there's definitely no coordination. So that brings me to here, where we are on a WOW site. It's just not yet been discovered by the broader community, but I think it's a wonderful opportunity to really showcase so many aspects of what is multiple land use, beneficial post-mining land use, concurrent land use, sequential land use, all of these things that are talked about. There's also a strategic framework around multiple land use that the Australian government's just produced, paid a lot of money. Again, the committee was formed, it's out there, you can read about it. There's actually no action, no energy behind it. It's just up to states to implement again, or local government through planning schemes, but there's no mechanism, there's no driving any of this. And the wonderful rehab work that's going on here around the mine, the research, the training, the actual mine itself, and the opportunities for greater use of the underground, even bringing in revenue through tourism and other things, if you just sort of put all the obstacles aside. And I see this wow site happening here, once you address the safety issues, environment, health, and really explore those values. In this case, there's assets, heritage mining research, there's education, greater education opportunities in the wider community, because Australia has this real challenge with the disconnect between the urban hubs and their understanding of why we have mines and why we need mines and how we use the products of mining. There's this really strong disconnect here compared with when you go to Germany. I particularly noticed in Germany how there's a much closer connection because longer history, sometimes just a lot of tradition built around mining. But often those old mines opened up for tourism, retired mining engineers running these tours, and just this energy that keeps going from the mining. So you keep telling that story, bring people in, it brings in revenue, and so I just always get that feel in the mining communities I go to in Germany that there is this really strong connection, there's this pride in mining, which we don't see so much here. So, and tourism, well, if we can climb the Story Bridge, we can take people underground and make money. So come on, let's do it. That's the long-term vision, anyway. And the capacity building around training and employment. So so much with students, graduates, and so on, and the stakeholders. Who are they all? Identify who they are, engage with each of them, and just show them the value of the site. So this is my little case study, I guess, of opportunity. That's how I see it. So, thank you very much. I just want to acknowledge my helpers from CMLR, co-authors and contributors. I've had a series of volunteers. Alison Walton was the volunteer who undertook the web-based search, and she's now an environmental regulator at Emerald. And where she said everything's done on checklists, and you don't have to engage your brain. There's lots of opportunities for improvement there. David Lawrence, who's done all the research on closure planning, why mine's closed, so that I've used his graphs. And we set up a web page around managing mining legacies workshop that we had and the value proposition. The Churchill Fellowship, which funded my studies in 2009. The Friends of the Uni Mine and Julia for bird walks with the Cumberland Witten Catchment Network. So thank you very much. Questions?
Don't involve questions.
Well, we've got to get into the next book, or write the next book of 101 uses or things to do with the whole grant. So that's the opportunity for the Kew experimental mine.
Just a comment, perhaps, we're talking about tourist opportunities and we leave this mine out for the moment, but there's a substantial difference between Australia and Europe and Canada in terms of the distances involved. I can't see tourist opportunities being a big factor in our mine sites because they're just too remote. Tourists are not going to travel out of their way to go and visit the mine.
Well, okay, so the first thing I would say is, so where's the data on that for those mines where there already is a strong tourism presence? So if you look at South Australia and the heritage trails there, where they've put it together and put together a map, and it makes it easy for you to actually take that trail through Kapunda and end up at Broken Hill or whatever. They've linked them together, they've put that effort in. If you don't have that resource, then people will just puddle along. But Mount Morgan, for example, is a major, grey nomad route heading north. Like people would pour through there and they'd all want to go on the mine tour. So one of the things when we were managing that site was to make sure that the tours were reinvigorated, had a whole lot new information about them, and linked up to the fire clay caverns where the dinosaur footprints were. So that was all on the site, very diverse. So yes, a lot of the sites are remote, but through the Queensland Heritage Trail Network, there was funding injected into some of these mine sites, but they also had other heritage sites. So what I see as being important is those linkages in regions. So there's a dinosaur trail that goes out from up in North Queensland. Once you package them together and you steer people along a path, and this is a tourism area that I'm not an expert in, but it's just an observation. Once you package them like that and make them attractive, people will follow it. They just want some easy path. Like there's a lot of people out there travelling that just want to go somewhere like that and find it interesting. So the injection of funding that came in through the Queensland Heritage Trail Network enabled us to do something at the mine site to develop the fire clay cabins. It enabled the community to develop a heritage trail, and we worked together on a working group to make sure we were integrated those things. So that little injection of funding, it wasn't huge, brings communities together around these issues and then provides some hope of enhancing the socio-economic opportunities. So this is like a building block. It's a maturity thing. It may not be as, it's nothing like the Rammelsburg mine in Germany, 1,000-year history. You've got art galleries in the power station, just amazing stuff. But if you look at that and sort of scale it back to Australia and think, okay, what are the key ingredients here? It's about collaboration, it's about understanding who the stakeholders are, it's about a business plan and a business focus. We could have an Australian heritage trail that links those significant mining heritage regions in Australia and in the future new regions. But if you think of the Kalgoorlie, the Victorian goldfields, South Australia, the first mines and so on, through Broken Hill and then up to Mount Morgan, it would be possible to piece that together. And then what the Chinese did in the gold mines in the Northern Territory. It's not physically possible to drive around in any time soon, but people could pick segments of that. Like all you need is, I think, leadership at different levels. So at a state level as well as at a national level, you could have some of these things happening. We've actually got at the moment Broken Hill going through a process of being listed on the National Heritage Register. The town and the community, all of the activities, Broken Hill City Council have nominated it. It's gone through, they've ticked all the boxes, and now they're working on management arrangements. But what's more than likely going to happen is Commonwealth Government will devolve that to local government and say, right, you worry about that and we're off. Instead of saying, right, we now have to inject something into this, set up an entity to coordinate these activities, instead of everyone operating separately, every mine shutting at a different time and just saying, right, this is yours, back on the Crown land. We have to actually see that there's mechanisms are needed, these vehicles for carrying landscapes forward, carrying the post-mining land use into a productive use. Otherwise we'll just have this dysfunction continue. So I do agree with you to a large degree. Lower population, less dense. But where we have this strength, we can build stronger connections, I think.
But I grew up in Ireland. There were a lot of tourists that went through there that had a lot of interest in seeing what the mine was. And it's not, you don't get much more remote than that. But
it's on the main road.
It's on the main road, and people want to go and see and want to experience it.
Yeah, and I
believe for those things 4 months in advance.
When they
When
they did run the underground tour, there was too much demand for it.
Yeah,
so
huge.
And they had to build a centre, like a tourist experience centre, to take care of.
You feel hot, you want to go.
People to give people the experience without really.
I actually think it's an unrealised demand, but with no evidence, it can't. Like I seek out mining towns and stuff, and wherever I go. And I know there are people that are interested in it, but we haven't pulled it together. So, I've written to Queensland Tourism and different people, but it's just like this voice in the dark, perhaps. So if we can just sort of, turn on the lights in different places, you'll suddenly everyone go, oh, no, this is an opportunity. But, if no one's actually doing research on this, who's gathering the data? So quite often we're just dealing with this void of information, but you might just start with a study. What is the potential of this? Where would you focus your effort? Where would be the best value for money in terms of best our effort, from a Commonwealth Government perspective. So, as well as Minerals Council of Australia, as well as AusOM, you could sort of bring them all in and say, right, well, we might focus on Broken Hill and just see what we can do. Or we might, because it's going to be the first mining town and community that's listed on the National Heritage Register. So it's all very well listing, but what do we do then? You're just going to buildings locked up because, it's a real challenge. It is, but I think we all just have to want it. Not happen. Sort of. Yeah.
We're just connecting with it as well. Having been through decommissioning and the criteria was, yes, it had to be put back to as it was before.
Yeah, back to dirt.
Which I argued against, and with the support of JCU campus historical people, and because I've been down to Burra and seen all that sort of interpretive facility, I said that'd be nice to have that so that people come in the future could see this. But we had to fight to not having to dig up all the foundations and all that sort of stuff. So we were able to at least leave all the concrete foundations, and so there's a bit of a trail so people could go, oh, there was a mill there and people lived there and all that sort of thing. But for the future, saving a lot of money as well, not having to chop it all up. So and it really has to tie in with other, it's not going to be a standalone tourist attraction, but Chiligo, the area it is, has got caves and Aboriginal paintings and things like that, so it becomes part of the total package that could be put on offer. But Chiligo is sort of more on people's route and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and
Except that people still want to operate around the area and actually mine and do things. So it does conflict a little bit with the secondary mining. You've got to have still available that people might want to go in there and tear it all up again and actually dig a great big hole with.
yeah, but at least if you know this side has got that potential, then that's fine, but this other one may not, so that one is good for tourism or whatever. But in China, of course, geoparks and geoheritage is much more, on the agenda and more highly valued. I don't think we, and geotourism. So I think that's underdone. When the Australian government just released their heritage strategy, the draft heritage strategy, mining was completely omitted, geoheritage was completely omitted, and I was so offended, I was moved to respond. But it was just kind of a shock to think, in the middle of this Broken Hill process, that you'll know about that, yet it came out with a really strong focus on only Indigenous heritage and a national park. Like I'm a greenie, but this was like a real, a green focus on heritage. That's probably a generalisation, but what I'm saying is this mining heritage, again, was undervalued. Like they've just not even picked it up. But anyway, that's why they put out documents for consultation, and that's why hopefully they'll listen. But
industrial heritage down 17 Mile Rock Road.
Exactly, that's a beautiful site. I love it. Yeah, except for the fact that
Nice mills there.
the fact that they dug up coral reefs, or it's another name, but it is a beautiful site. I love it. I love that industrial heritage, and that's I probably learnt most of it through Mount Morgan, through industrial archaeologist. And but once you start to understand the site, you don't want anything removed, but more than anything, you don't actually want it. You don't want it renovated. It's about conservation and just stopping the decay, but also providing safe access for people to tell the story. You actually don't have to do a lot internally, like the power station at Mount Morgan. If you put a new roof and a ramp for equity access, there's a whole lot of things that we looked at. We did a whole interpretation plan for the site. It's all sitting there. It can all be brought back to life. The gold room could have been transformed. It's all full of drill core, and we had an interpretation centre plan concept for that, where you just lead people down. It's all either glassed off or with some transparent screening, so people don't go in there. But you've just got row upon row of drill core in this sort of dark, solid building, and it's just a beautiful place. You could do so much with it.
Well, that's part of the value, is to retain it for when it might become economic. So
Yes, I agree.
whether through commodity prices or technology.
Okay, but if the pit's full of water and you've got to actually weigh up the liability. So when I talk to other people about it, they say, the resource has been compromised, or the value's been undermined because of those liabilities. And so it is hard to disentangle, historic legacy. Some sites it's easy, so right, that's historic, you can mine over there and they're separate, but at Mount Morgan it's all interwoven. But it's all fine if they're bringing the right knowledge to the challenge, but sometimes you've got mine safety people trying to, make decisions about things, and they're not actually really effectively engaging with the expertise. That's another story, but that's a risk.
Are there any leading lights in Australia for closure? Is there any site that sort of stands out?
Look, aluminium and Alcoa, West Australia, is always held up, but that's back to native forests, so that's the Darling Ranges in West Australia. So 20 years ago, when I was working in a uranium mine, that was always the best rehab in Australia. At Go, another bauxite operation, it's got excellent rehab, and if you look at the key ingredients there, it's that really long-term focus on continual improvement. In Alcoa, it was a research team dedicated to that, understanding all the problems with, so they had objectives, clear targets for biodiversity. If they weren't achieving it, what was it? Was it the seed? Was it the timing? Was it the moisture? What it was, at dormancy breaking mechanisms, they would study it. And so you see this graph that shows every time they've intervened with research, they've improved. So they've actually had about, it's 800 hectares. It's a large area signed off, actually approved. They can leave, they've done the right thing. And it's a water catchment for Perth, so it's been in the spotlight. So that's Alcoa. Up at Gove, it was one individual, an agricultural scientist, a German, Dieter Hinz, 35 years, engaging with the Aboriginal people, walking through the bush. A good observational kind of scientist. Every year he did rehab, he could look and learn and take notes. You don't have that anymore. We don't have many sites. He retired, he was trying to write a book. I say, hurry up, write that book, great knowledge. But then you have another company come in, they've got a different attitude, bring someone else in, and it becomes a bit more of a checklist. I'll do this year, and it's lost that intimate knowledge of the landscape. Sometimes even the relationship with the Aboriginal people who are collecting the seed and doing the work has been broken down. So they're very vulnerable links sometimes, if they can be built up over a long time, but easily lost. So the shining lights around ecology, perhaps they're sand mining, bauxite, they're at the easy end of rehab. Metalliferous mines, I think, are struggling. I think Kidston made good progress. I think the Red Dome did a whole heap of stuff. You can name a few. But they never got sign off. I don't think they quite.
We're still operating leases around here, don't
Yeah.
we?
Okay. So it is an easy. Okay, so it's a good thing if there is more mining, but it's also an easy thing for the government to say, oh, it might one day be. So when you've got really significant risks of water and it's already overflowing and no clean water to actually produce the slaked lime to treat the water, you're starting to get problems at a site where there's even stability, well, there are stability issues as well and safety for downstream. But it gets to a point where, okay, well, it's not under complete control anymore. Anyway, so the idea there was to draw down the pit and then do some reprocessing, put stuff back into the pit, but something didn't happen for 6 or 7 years, and so suddenly you have Cyclone Oswald, tips the whole balance on the viability of the project. So there aren't too many leading lights. I think Century Zinc are probably the stage where they're contemplating closure, so it might be better to make rockwool be habitat than try and, there's a whole lot of stuff that could happen, but yeah. So government requirements are we don't have a legislative requirement for closure planning in Queensland. It might sound odd, but there's a rehabilitation planning guideline, but nobody's actually said this is how you close a mine here, with all the government departments agreeing. It's part of the dysfunction. Western Australia has done that now, and while it might be seen as more green tape, it's actually, I think, helpful for industry, certainly for someone who goes and writes closure plans and helps mining companies to do that process. I think it's much better to have that guideline, because it shows the Environment Department, Mines Department, both got their stamp on it. We've agreed on this process. In Queensland, the Auditor General says there's so much stuff not getting talked about since 2000 when the Department of Mines and Energy split. And that's at the time when I was working there, so I saw what happened, what needed to happen. Still hasn't happened, but may come together with the change of government, I'm not sure.
Is it structure, or is it the funding that gets... I guess with the abandoned mines, it'd be certainly a funding issue.
Well, in Queensland, with the $6.5 million they've been spending a year, you could argue that they could spend some more on the strategy policy level than just what they've been doing. So at the moment, they're just focused on getting rid of the red dots on the map, so just filling shafts. So it's not a very strategic approach, I don't think. In fact, they've gone and demolished a whole heap at Herberton and upset the locals because they were significant from a heritage perspective. So you think, oh my God,
But honestly, what happened in East Germany with a lot of funding?
Yeah, that's true. That scale, they had federal funding, state funding. They had, they had industry support as well, because there's one company still operating. They had, and that multi-stakeholder engagement is critical. So if we just want to leave it to, while the state government says this is our problem, go away, and not engaging, then it's partly being created by them. So they'll say money's a problem, but if they're not engaging, they're actually not connecting. So
if you don't have a plan of what you're going to spend your money on, you're not going to get money.
No, that's part of the problem as well. There's no policies, no clear strategy, and there's nothing in the public domain that you can find about performance reporting. There's no deliberate attempt, but I would argue we're stuck on first base in Queensland because it's managed by the Mine Safety Department, perfectly capable for looking after safety issues, but not the rest. That's something that's just happened in the last 4 years. So it's got a narrow focus. And so why are they trying to manage water monitoring quality data when that's the Environment Department, go to them, and there's been that reviews, the Queensland Flood Commission inquiry, the Kelleher review, all of these reviews all saying what needs to happen, it just hasn't happened. So what's happening there that they don't want that to happen? Why can't we have cross-functional integration? Governments must be hard. So So sorry. No. I think this is the place to
I
shine.
can just remember when I was in the West, some of the pits were closing, they were talking about fish farms and all sorts of eco-tourism. There's a background in oil made and
Yeah.
sort of area.
Yeah, I think
I don't think it happened.
no, even at QMAG, several friends were talking about fish farms, and I think that was probably one of those sites where they had more chance of happening, but I'm not sure. So I do think the legislative side has to be a little bit creative as well and encourage that sort of thinking. But we actually don't have a lot of success there, so there's a whole lot of study needed. So, well, what are the obstacles? I heard that even New Hope Coal didn't want to surrender some of their tenure because even if they've done the rehab, because they're worried that the mines department will just open it up and offer it to another company. So you can have that as well. It happened at Pine Creek where a company came and started peeling back the covers off some very good rehab, because actually that's a good example where they had sequential mining over about 5 different pits, were able to backfill and end up with one pit with water in it. And very successful rehab because in the last few years they modified the process to process oxide tails instead of the sulphide. So they had some good, more benign tailings at the top and then some oxide waste at the top. So they got all that right. And then this company came and started peeling back and the government said, right, you touch that, this is going to cost you this much liability. Don't just go poking around there without purpose. So that is an issue that some companies have done the good rehab and want to get away. They don't actually want another company coming in peeling back because their reputation is linked to that site still. But let's not say it's all too hard because I think we can all do something. It's just a complex issue, and so I'm just trying to raise awareness about it and do some research in some areas that may make a difference. And the work in Peru is really around geological regions and understanding the water quality there. So that's Mansour's part, and then I'm looking at how they integrate that from one region across multiple regions because they want mining to proceed in Peru and they know that the legacy sites are an impediment while they exist, and they know the water resources are important. What are those critical elements that are in the water that are threatening human health or whatever? Let's fix that up and show that it can be done, because where you have success then the community can say, oh okay, this can be done. But if you just leave it and say you can't do it, then it just hangs around and becomes a bigger problem. So I'll stop.
Thank you very much
Thank you.
for this discussion.